key change to the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act is the introduction of local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services. The transitional period for the new Act, the old Act comes in on the 31st of July and the new Act takes force. It's important to understand what the new local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Service does, what their role is, and I suppose who's going to form these services, because they play a critical role in the due diligence process that we've discussed earlier, and also the management of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So under the existing legislation, the Aboriginal Heritage Act, there wasn't, I suppose, a local Aboriginal cultural heritage service like this. There was a committee that was in charge of kind of determining whether there was Aboriginal cultural material in a particular part of the state, so recognising heritage objects, landscapes that are of particular significance to Aboriginal people. The local Aboriginal Cultural Services is a new body. It's really established to have a very broad role when it comes to Aboriginal cultural heritage. So these services are going to be in the regions, and their role is going to be managing existing Aboriginal cultural heritage, Aboriginal sites, protected areas within the state. They're also going to have a vital role when it comes to negotiating and engaging with landowners and proponents that want to undertake activities on land where Aboriginal cultural heritage exists, or where they're undertaking activities where there could be a risk to harm of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So they're going to play a very important role in, I suppose, landowners and proponents undertaking activities. They also have an important role because they engage with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Council and the Minister. So they can make recommendations about whether or not a proponent can undertake an activity, a plan, get a permit to undertake an activity that may cause Aboriginal cultural harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. So their role is wide stretching, and particularly when we look at the tier system and the due diligence system. So if a proponent wants to undertake a tier 2 activity, so moderate ground disturbance, they really need to consult the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services as the first port of call if they do a search on the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Directory and there is Aboriginal cultural heritage on the land on which they want to undertake the activity. The local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services will be responsible for then just, engaging with that proponent and providing them with information about whether a survey has been undertaken, whether there's a report. Although this information should be on the directory, essentially these services are there so that they can guide proponents and landowners through this due diligence process. If an investigation needs to be undertaken for like a tier 3 activity, then they'll also be involved in that investigation process. They'll also direct landowners and proponents to the relative native title groups, knowledge holders within that area, that are also going to be able to help them understand whether there is Aboriginal cultural heritage and whether their activities may or may not harm the existing heritage within that area. So they play a very key role, and it is a very big change from the existing legislation, because essentially the Act empowers these services to be the first port of call when someone wants to undertake an activity. Now, yes, like I said, the LACHS, so we're calling them LACHS, the Local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services, all their information is meant to be included on the directory. So that's the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Directory, which can be accessed online through the Department of Lands, Planning and Heritage, through their website. And so that'll have details of all registered Aboriginal cultural heritage, Aboriginal sites and protected areas within the state, but it will also have corresponding information for the correct services to contact in the event that you have to consult them about your activity. The services, that local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services, will also be heavily involved if you're undertaking a Tier 3 activity that requires an Aboriginal Cultural Heritage plan. So in previous videos I've mentioned that a Tier 2 activity will require a permit, and a Tier 3 activity will require an Aboriginal Cultural Heritage plan if there is a risk to Aboriginal cultural heritage. And so the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services will be heavily involved in consulting with other knowledge holders in the area, conducting surveys, evaluations, gathering information so that you can develop a plan to undertake the activity and reduce risk to Aboriginal cultural heritage. At the moment, because the Act is so new, the services themselves are still being developed. So we don't know where they're actually going to be located. They're just so far they're going to be located in the regions. We don't know who's actually going to form those services as yet. The legislation is, said to qualify to be, I suppose, a member representative of these local Aboriginal cultural services. a person needs to have adequate knowledge in the area. They have to have adequate knowledge of cultural heritage, that exists within that area, and whether there's any Aboriginal sites, protected areas. So as yet, we don't know who's going to form them, where they're going to be, where their officers are going to be. They have released, so the government has released sort of timelines as when you need to contact Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services. So if you're sort of undertaking activity, a Tier 2 activity that requires a permit, you are required to contact the services, as soon as you kind of recognise that there is Aboriginal cultural heritage or a risk of harming Aboriginal cultural heritage. You then have to follow up and contact them regularly if you don't hear from them. If you don't hear from them, then you turn to native title holders, you turn to knowledge holders in the area. But essentially, these local services are going to be your first port of call. And so there is guidelines about what their role is, how much they can charge, because they can. The legislation does allow them to charge fees if they're assisting you with a plan. And so that is all contained in these guidelines. Now, there's about 8 documents that form these guidelines. So there's a code, there's a time frame document, there's an activities document, and then obviously there's a separate document for consultation. So it's important that if to gain knowledge about this Aboriginal Act, that you also refer to the guidelines in the code. And if you have questions specifically about who you should be contacting and so forth, your first port of call should always be the directory. Obviously, we can assist by helping you guide you through that process. But the government has indicated that all this information about who you need to contact, if you do need to contact someone after doing the due diligence process, is to refer to the directory. So the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, as I said, is available online, and that will be your first port of call to work out who you need to contact and consult if you're wishing to undertake activities on your land that may harm Aboriginal cultural heritage. Thank you.